Over the last few years, I've tried to make videos helping as many of you as possible grow tropical style or unusual plants here in the UK and other colder climate countries. I enjoy sharing the plants and places which I find interesting. A small part of me hopes that, for some of you at least, filming a gorgeous garden on a beautiful day, golden sunlight filtering through the garden, it really does provide a bit of escapism and inspiration for those of you sitting at home on a grim rainy day. Well, unfortunately today I've got it the wrong way around and things here are certainly on the grim side. But it's time for a little walk around, and in today's video I'm talking about overwintering, particularly for my jungle style plants, how my overwintering methods and practices might have changed over the last few years, and also what I've done and at what points I will be doing things throughout the winter months. So let's get started and a little walk around the garden. Just passing through here, we've got the typical evergreens here in my garden, bamboos, palms. I do nothing to protect those in winter. Both are very capable of taking extreme cold, and it would really take something severe to actually knock these plants back. So if you've got a Trachycarpus palm or a bamboo, chances are there's nothing you need to do other than maybe tap them a little bit if the snow's very heavy. Don't be tempted to wrap Trachycarpus up, and in fact I would only say that small plants in pots actually need any kind of care here in most UK winters, and all you can do, and all I do, is just bring them close to the house, keep them tucked away somewhere sheltered, and that protects them from the worst of the cold. I mean, if you have got a polytunnel greenhouse, you can use that to keep potted ones in, but other than that I do nothing at all. So passing through here, you'll see a proper collection of big leaves and all kinds of different foliage plants. So let's look a little bit deeper about what I do to look after them. Well, let's start from the top, shall we? Up here we've got Salvia concolor, which you saw in my last video, flowering away, better late than never I suppose. This Salvia has proved to be, we'll say, equally hardy as Amistad here in my garden. Yes, they get blackened, browned and beaten down by the winter weather, but it comes back for me. If you live in a colder area, you've got damp soil, I generally would recommend getting cuttings at this time of year. Although a lot of Salvias are actually widely accepted as hardy now, that might not be the case for your location. And that really is a crucial theme through this video and for a lot of garden plants. Don't listen to what any one person says, even me. Definitely take into account where you live, your garden conditions, and I'm talking about location, how rural you are, and also how your soil is. Does it drain well in winter, or is it proper clay, claggy and wet? That can dramatically affect the likelihood of your plants going through winter. But looking through here, we've got a Tetrapanax, a Rex. I don't do anything to protect those. Rex, and indeed the standard Tetrapanax papyrifer, they are pretty tough and hardy. Yes, while they're small like this, they can still be cut back down to the ground. Check out my video at Shane Bilson's garden to see some which get cut back, or at least have got cut back every single year, and still provide a magnificent display by the end of summer. Once they get to a decent size, like the one that you might notice at Jenny Rogers, the Secret Garden of Louth, they're pretty much tough and hardy for the vast majority of winters. But at this size, I pretty much leave them to it. The only time I protect them is actually in late spring, if there is a very late frost. If they're at this stage now, just starting to get new leaves pushing through, it's a shame to lose that, so I try to put a couple of fleece bags over the top, but during winter I simply leave them to it. If you've got a very young plant that's in a pot, I would certainly recommend moving it to a polytunnel or greenhouse, but I wouldn't bring it inside really, unless it is properly minute. You're better off keeping it dormant somewhere and away from the worst of the cold. Looking through, you can see Musa basjoo, the Japanese hardy banana. We'll talk more about those later. And at the back, we've got Musa Tibet, which isn't a widely grown banana, quite a new one to me. And this one, I protected last winter with some fleece bags and it came through okay. So it's actually surprisingly tough and hardy, and I'll be doing the same again this year. But if you've got an unusual plant which you're not sure how hard it is, it's always worth getting an insurance plant. Take a cutting, take a little pup off it, do whatever you need to do for the plant to have at least some kind of security in case the main plant doesn't make it through. When it comes to Persicaria then, the frost zaps these plants right back down to the ground. And whilst they're nowhere near as troublesome as the knotweed which are related to, these Persicaria are very, very tough and they will spring back from anything. So absolutely nothing needed here. all I tend to do is just hack them back a little bit before the first real cold, just to stop them getting brown and mushy and creating a right mess. And you can chuck some of the actual leaves and stems over the clump itself, but there's no real need to mulch. As we head through here, all the beautiful green tones. Let's look at a plant which I have cut back, but you don't actually need to yet. This plant here is Zantedeschia Hercules, and the only reason I've cut it back is so I can actually get through here with a barrow, and now obviously we're at the back end of the season. You can leave Zantedeschia Hercules in the ground through winter. Yes, it looks stunning, big leaves, a very exotic look. It can kind of look like it's melted when there is a real severe freeze, especially one that lasts a few days. But for me here in my garden, it's come back every single year. So if yours is potted, maybe move it to a greenhouse or polytunnel, at least closer to your house. But there's no need to dig them up specifically to bring them inside for winter, at least not for me here in North Lincolnshire. Looking through now, that beautiful maple, which was red just a couple of weeks ago, has now shed most of its leaves. And the real focus of the beauty here is that beautiful Berinda lushuiensis. You can now see that gorgeous blue patterning. I did mention in my last video, this isn't the hardiest of bamboos, only really capable of taking around -7 and -8 before it starts to look, we'll say, a little bit ropey and brown, but I simply leave it to it. Like I said, with the bamboos here in my garden, other than knocking the snow off them, I do nothing to look after in winter. And the same applies to my ground ferns. For me, I don't really grow any tender ground ferns. I grow a huge variety of different hardy ones, some evergreen, some deciduous. I think they look absolutely stunning. And at this time of year, as I saw in Georgina's garden, I think it really is important to have such a big part of your garden and the greenery which makes it beautiful just be something you don't have to look after in winter. It really is a load off your mind. But when it comes to tree ferns, well, as you saw in my last video, we've got some here, 1 foot tall, this beauty, and we've got some taller ones. So have my views on overwintering tree ferns changed since I made that full video talking about how I look after them in winter? Well, no, they haven't really. So I'll link that video in the description if you want to watch it. The only thing I would say is I'm more mindful now about really putting the effort to protect tree ferns. I absolutely think it's worthwhile. So you can see this one here, it's actually got some leaves there, some leaf litter from the neighbouring cherry trees just in the crown. You might recall my good friend Mark over at his crazy tiki garden with his very, we'll say, relaxed overwintering practices. All he does is leave the leaves in the crown. Another tongue twister I managed to work in. He leaves the leaves in the crown and those protect it from the frost. Personally, I wouldn't rely on that. Although I lucky enough to get a lot of leaves on the trees next door, I don't just use those to protect the crown. And in fact, I still follow my 3-step method of protecting tree ferns. Getting a ball of fleece. You can use straw, but fleece is generally more breathable, easier to remove. And I push it into the crown of a tree fern. So that's the crown in there, right at the base here of the fronds. It holds in quite well, just push it right in there. The ball of fleece simply helps protect any new crosiers and the most tender part of the plant from any frosts and freezes that can occur over winter. Again, fleece is better because you can remove it easier if required, and it doesn't necessarily get soggy and freeze right through. So when do I do that? Well, I'll be doing that right before we have the first real freeze. I guess really any time now, we're heading into mid to late November, is a good time to do it. And that way it's a job out of the way. And just with that little bit of frost protection in the crown, these tree ferns can take a surprising amount of cold. Yes, they might come from Australia, but these plants do see cold in their habitat. They see snow, they see frost. So with a bit of crown protection, you can really give them the edge in a mild winter, and that's all you need to do. But as I talk about in that other video, which I'll link to below, if there's cold of, say, -3, -4, a real sustained freeze forecast, I protect the top foot of the trunk of each tree fern. Just wrap some fleece around. I keep a big box fit in the shed there, ready to go. And that just gives it a little bit of extra protection through the colder spells. And if the temperatures look like they're going to drop down to -6, -7, somewhere around there, then I get a bigger roll of fleece. I'll put a link in the video below to some 2-meter rolls over on Amazon, but check out eBay as well for good prices. I get a 2-meter roll, or maybe a 1-meter, and just wrap the whole trunks of the tree ferns. I just wrap the whole thing as much as I possibly can if there is real cold of, we'll say, -6, -7, or a few freezing days with ice days forecast, I don't think you can be too careful with tree ferns. But the crucial thing is, I wrap it up for the duration of the cold, and it helps protect them from the worst of the cold and also any drying winds which might accompany it. But as soon as the cold's gone, I take it off, and that way this trunk can take in all the glorious wet weather, which I know we'll have plenty of here in the UK during winter. So it's important you don't wrap your tree ferns entirely for the whole of winter. They definitely would prefer to be outside, taking in plenty of this autumn moisture, the milder weather while it's here. You've got probably more risk of your tree fern drying out in winter than dying of cold damage in most normal winters. So it's a case of being prepared and proactively looking at the forecast and adjusting what you do to your tree fern to suit the temperatures expected. So really at this time of the year, all I'll do in the next couple of weeks is to look at protecting the crowns themselves. Yes, it's perfectly normal if the tree fern fronds in more exposed plants like these ones here go brown. That can happen with a freezing fog or temperature of around -3, -4. If your tree fern is tucked away, it's got some overhead cover like this one here, it's a lot more likely to stay green. Beautiful plants, they do have the limits though when it comes to winter temperatures they can tolerate, so I think it's well worth being prepared and knowing what you need to do and at what temperatures. Another glorious palm there, but like I mentioned, Trachycarpus, unlike the advice I see in some popular gardening groups, you don't need to wrap these just because they're a palm. They come from cooler areas of Asia that can see a lot of cold. They can be very, very tough, and I'm talking say -12 or below really before they can take any kind of damage. I wouldn't worry about temperatures down to -10 unless we're talking weeks and weeks of it. And in fact, the only person I'd heard of who'd actually commented on one of my videos saying that they'd had damage, they were up in Scotland and it was a newly planted Trachycarpus and they had a few days of around -10. So it's the duration of the freeze that caused the problems, and also the fact that it was a newly planted one. So as a result, the root ball was very small and essentially it was like a potted plant which just got frozen right through. So other than that, I don't worry about the Trachycarpus here. And in fact, if I had to worry about protecting those, the temperatures would mean there'll be a lot of other plants I'd have to protect first. But anyway, on that note, let's head through and see a little bit more. The bamboo leaning over, this Fagecia angustissima, it definitely shows why I tend to knock the snow off if I'm at home or can come out after a heavy snowfall. A little bit of rain, it's already got it leaning over, so a bit of snow and I wouldn't be pushing through here, would I? So let's come through a bit more. You might see a little pumpkin I put out there for the birds and hopefully not the rats. So panning around a little bit more and you'll see now what I suppose could be described as waves of greenery. This view is basically all my glorious evergreen plants. I say evergreen, the tree ferns, like I said, they can brown in a colder winter, but usually in a mild to normal winter, they still display those magnificent fronds. The bamboos now are just huge billowing clouds of leaves, the Trachycarpus up there. It's fair to say this view in the garden here, it's not just a summer display, it's a 24/7, 365 beautiful display of gorgeous evergreen greenery. And a lot of these plants I don't do anything for in winter. I mention that just for those of you watching who maybe don't grow a lot of tropical style plants. You might be afraid that every plant needs wrapping. It's entirely possible to have huge areas of your garden, or your whole garden even, just not needing anything in terms of winter protection. But from that to a plant which certainly, I'm sure most of you will know, needs to come in. This Ensete ventricosum Maurelii, this is a plant which I'm sure most of you know is a tender plant. When do I bring it in? Well, we're now approaching the middle of November. Let's face it, these have had a good innings this year, and I wouldn't hold anything against you if you've already brought yours in or you're planning on doing it over the next week or so. For me, I might do mine in the next couple of weeks, but I only do it when there's a real risk of a proper frost on the horizon, there's a freeze forecast, or we're at the time of year when the daytime temperatures drop below 10 degrees. Now, that's be happening consistently in about 2 weeks' time. So I'll look at the weather forecast. Download a weather app, BBC Weather, there's plenty of other more accurate ones apparently available. Whichever one you use, just keep an eye on the temperatures. And if it gets to the point where nighttime temperatures are regularly below 4 degrees, or daytime temperatures below about 10, that plant's not really going to be growing much. At this time of year, we definitely reach a point of diminishing returns to these plants. Yes, it's important to not bring everything in too early and to really minimise the amount of time that plants spent wrapped up, brought inside, dug up, chopped back. The shorter your overwintering period, the happier plants will be. But equally, there does come a point in late autumn where the plant's just not going to grow anymore, and you might as well bring it in if you've got a few precious daylight hours to get it sorted. So for me, I'll be bringing this one and the other Ensetes I've got further up the garden in, we'll say, a couple of weeks, pushing it to December if I can, but that's just for bragging purposes. Looking around then, you can see a mixture of really tough evergreen hardy plants. Carl, I'm going to mention the spider's web again, just because it looks so fantastic, doesn't it? Plants like that, not only do you not worry about them in winter, but they also really show off. Absolutely gorgeous, like it's always frosted, a beautiful plant. There are plants though which definitely don't enjoy our winter temperatures, and judging from some of these, haven't really enjoyed our summer temperatures either. Yes, it's time to look again at my miserable Coleus plants. This is a plant which used to do quite well for me at the old house, where there was more sun, richer soil, raised up. They really were a reliable source of summer colour, beautiful leaves. In fact, this one, yeah, it's just faded now, and what you tend to find is they are probably one of the most tender of tender plants, and much under 10 degrees, and they start to slowly fade away. So Coleus would definitely be one of the plants. If you're looking at keeping it for next year, you can dig up the whole plant, put it in a pot, bring it inside, treat it as a house plant. And I really would say plants like that, which need to come in as a house plant, now is the time to be doing it. There's no benefit to pushing things anymore. And as we push into late November, there's always more and more chance now that any cold spells aren't just going to be a light freeze, there'll be a proper freeze. So really look around your gardens over the next week or so and see if there's any real tender plants. Now is the time to bring them in. So with Coleus, you can either bring the whole plant in as a house plant, grow it in a conservatory, something like that. Don't store it, like with any of these plants which I talk about growing as a houseplant, next to a radiator. They really won't enjoy the dry air. You need to keep the humidity up a little bit, but they'll grow perfectly well as a houseplant. You can alternatively take cuttings of these plants. They grow very well from cuttings, but what I found is you don't really want to stuff your windowsills full of Coleus cuttings because, let's face it, they're going to be there a long time. So maybe, I know it's not the most environmentally sound advice, Coleus are a plant which are best off bought every year as plug plants in spring, potentially, unless you got one which has done really well for you and you want to propagate it for next year. I certainly wouldn't heat a greenhouse or polytunnel just for the purpose of overwintering them. That would be ridiculous. But when it comes to these begonias here, these Merrymakers, I think these are grown quite nicely. And as I mentioned in my last video, I think I'm going to keep that one there. And actually looking at them, I might try to keep them all. Tender begonias, but again, I'll be growing these as houseplants over winter, where I'm sure they'll enjoy a cool spot somewhere, and I'll try to keep them watered enough to keep the humidity up around them. Spinning round though, well, regular viewers will notice there's a lot more space than usual. A lot more space. And also, there might be some wheelbarrow marks there. Someone's been barrowing a lot of cobbles and sand up here very recently. Could it be that there's been a little bit more progress in tidying up there? Well, you'll have to subscribe and check out our video coming very soon. Well, in the next couple of months anyway. But that aside, the Gunnera. Yes, I've taken a decision yesterday to chop the beast back. These gargantuan leaves are once again just being used to protect the crowns from the winter weather. Yes, I know there's been a lot of updated guidance on how to grow, cultivate, look after Gunnera from the RHS and DEFRA over the last year or so. What I'll be doing here in my garden is what I see as responsible, protecting the plants which I've already got, like they do at Chatsworth and other big gardens. To look after these plants in winter, the actual plants themselves are very tough, but the main buds of the plants in the crown, huge buds about the size of a melon, I try to protect them from winter, and this is the way that every big garden I've seen them grown in has done it. Simply create a kind of teepee wigwam over the top of the crown, using these leaves around it, and then weigh it down with those hefty stems there. They really are solid. Now, one thing I will add when it comes to look after Gunnera in winter is that this protection, although it's how most places do it, it looks good and it also keeps most of the cold off. If it's an exceptionally long, wet winter, followed by wet spells at the end, it's not the best protection. It's not going to last forever. So what I tend to do is keep some fleece on hand, just in case you have a windy spell. because those leaves dry out, get blown away. You still need to protect that crown. So do we like this to start? Yes, I like the idea that you've got self-sufficient protection, but just have some fleece handy, and I use that, stuff it over the crown, cover it with either a bit of tarpaulin or a large plastic pot, and that does the job. I had a little sweep around as well, you might notice, slightly less autumn leaves, and that's because they've gone over here. So, as we zoom over here, you'll notice this part of the garden is a collection of, yes, there's tough and hardy exotics, but there's also a lot more begonias. Begonia grandis, Sapporo, there's a few different ones growing here. Just starting to display their sort of autumn colouring now. They do look a bit tired. And what protects these? Very simply, a nice mulch. And I know a lot of plants now, you don't need to mulch them. Mulching tended to be something old-fashioned, but let's face it, mild winters trick us into doing less and less every year, don't they? But I still think it's worth putting some old leaves and maybe the cut down can of foliage on them, just to provide a little bit of protection from the cold weather. But they are reliably tough and hardy, and they should come back without any worries at all. One plant which I will be mounting my leaves around is this ginger. And in fact, the others I've got repeated through this section of the garden. This is Hedychium Assam Orange. As we saw last time, we've got a mighty berry crop there, haven't we? Both of them there still bobbing on, doing okay. Now, gingers. These are a plant which you might hear a few different opinions on overwintering. Some people leave them in the ground every year, like with cannas and salvias, and they come back no problem. Other people have completely lost them, they haven't come through at all. Here, my experiences have been mixed. So the ginger, which I've talked about most of my videos, is Hedychium gardnerianum. And that one I found, if I grow it in a pot and move it to a polytunnel greenhouse for winter, just keep it freeze-free, we'll say, it does okay. It flowers every year, it looks fantastic in late summer, early autumn time. The gingers which I've left in the ground, let's show you one actually. Oh yes, here we are. Look at that. Just because a plant is technically hardy doesn't mean it's worth growing or that you'd want it to necessarily survive. So what I found is, here in my garden, which is quite shady, the ground can often be quite damp in winter, particularly if there's a lot of this kind of weather come in. It's not the best environment for overwintering plants in the ground. As you might have heard Monty talk about on Gardener's World and other people speak about, your garden really does define what you need to do in winter. If you've got very wet, claggy soil, plants which can stay in the ground from rhizomes, corms, tubers, often just won't make it. And as I've found here, even if they do, because most of the garden really here is shaded, and if we get a cool summer, it can just take too long for them to come back. It simply isn't worth your time growing them. And even if the plant actually grows, you're not going to see any flowers. When it comes to gingers, they're all about the flowers. So what have I done differently? I'm keeping the Gardnerianum in pots, staying in pots now. I'm not going to grow it in the ground anymore. And instead, I've chosen this variety, Assam Orange, as a reliably performing variety, which I've talked about in my last video, because it flowers earlier in the season and it's supposed to be very tough and easy. So what I'll be doing is leaving these alone. I won't chop the foliage down until it really starts to get messy, and I will mulch them at the base. So at the minute, that's just some old leaves, but you can use old compost, maybe compost on one of your summer displays in a container. You can use bark chippings, you can use cut down plants, cut down cannas, anything like that. Just provide a couple of inches at least of organic material, stopping the frost from really getting through to the rhizome, and that should be it. So I'm going to try it this year. I think what I'm really trying to say is you need to experiment a little bit. If you've got multiples of a plant, try one out in your garden, bring the other inside. You've really got to roll the dice a little bit and experiment to find out what grows best for you. But for me here, I know my garden is just too damp in winter and too shaded to reliably overwinter most cannas and gingers in the ground and still get a good display the following year. So it's really a case for me of experimenting over the years, choosing what works, sticking with it, and then keeping the others in the polytunnel or greenhouse frost-free. I should probably say I haven't built my polytunnel yet. That'll be in a couple of weeks' time, so it really would be appreciated if the weather can just hold off until then. So at the minute, most of my potted plants are right up that end of the garden near the house. I've got big pots of cannas and gingers, which simply go into the polytunnel, small scheffler and palms, which again, into polytunnel, just kept about frost-free, and anything tender, like the Begonia luxurians you saw in the last video, is right outside the back door, ready to go inside with the Ensete before we have a first real freeze, which hopefully will be a good way off. So again, most of the plants here, beautiful begonias, those gingers. The fuchsias, I'm not sure if I will stick with them again, but I've got to say they are quite welcome at this time of year. A beautiful salmon coloured pop in the garden, and they really tie in well with the lovely yellow and orange leaves. I do actually like, we've got a leaf down here I saw earlier. Look at that one there. Beautiful ginger leaf, half and half. Lovely, isn't it? So when it comes to overwintering, panning around the garden here, most people will just see this as a jungle garden. But the reality is, it's a mixture of plants. We've got plants like the Fatsias, which really come into their own at this time of year. Look fantastic, beautiful glossy leaves. The bamboos and Scheffler I don't tend to worry about. The tree ferns need some protection. The one that's struggling, I really will be protecting it slightly more than I need to and keeping up with the watering. That is the other crucial thing. With tree ferns especially, if we have dry winter spells, which, well, let's face it, this autumn was being very dry until today, here at least, it's well worth watering them. And if there has been a real freeze combined with really dry winds, I absolutely would come out and give the tree ferns a watering. Obviously not whilst it's freezing, if your hose even works, but if we do get dry spells in winter and your tree ferns starting like that or grayer, give it a good soak in. This Scheffler over here, this is Rhododendrofolia. And when it comes to overwintering for Schefflers, for me, the most critical thing is that you don't plant them out in your garden until they're a decent size. So apologies, that's absolutely no use for you if you've already planted yours out and it's tiny. But I generally would recommend waiting until they're a couple of feet tall with a nice woody stem or trunk. Definitely wider than, say, a pencil, as I've seen Shane Bilson write on Facebook. That's the best time to plant them out. Anything younger than that and you really are gambling. So if you've got a young Scheffler in a pot, I would definitely keep it, ideally, in a frost-free greenhouse or polytunnel and don't let it completely dry out. And for those of you that have got them in the ground, like this Rhododendrofolia, Taiwaniana, really, I don't tend to do anything to look after them. I think if you start fleecing them, wrapping them up, you can do more harm than good. And a bit of fleece doesn't really do that much to protect plants from cold, especially once it's stuck to the main plant itself. And let's face it, if a freeze lasts more than a few hours anyway, a fleece really is limited in terms of what it's doing. So I generally would leave plants like Tetrapanax and Schefflers just to their own devices. You might get, like with this one here, the winter, if it is a bad one like this one was in 22, it can chop the plant back. But often that can lead to the plant branching, so I guess silver linings really. Sometimes you get more plant as a result of it. I would absolutely leave them to it. So panning round, there is one plant which I need to feature. That Tetrapanax, that will just slowly sort of fade away. They're pretty much deciduous here in our climate. A lot of these plants will yellow now, go brown and slowly fade into the ground. But we need to talk about Musa basjoo, because this is a plant which I know a lot of you Google, Facebook, how to look after it in winter. And there really are so many options. For me, it absolutely depends on how big your plant is and where you are in the country. It really is as simple as that. Musa basjoo is a plant which can take an extreme amount of cold. It can come back from the ground. I know a lot of you watching know this already. It's a plant which can take real freezes, but it's all about how big your plant is in particular. As the plant gets bigger, more established, that root mass is able to take a lot more cold. This plant here was only planted out, I think, as a small plant in spring 2021, somewhere around there. If you've got a very young plant, I would definitely protect it. If it's in a pot, certainly move it to a polytunnel or greenhouse. And if it's in the ground, I would absolutely build a little enclosure around it. When your plant gets bigger though, it's entirely down to what temperatures this winter is going to have and how much you value the height. So this plant in particular here, I didn't protect it one year and it got frozen right back down to the ground. So essentially I had to start back again, which when they're relatively established isn't the end of the world. But if you get that cold winter followed by a cool summer, then it means the banana is not going to be very impressive. The winter after, I decided to just use fleece bags, basically not bother protecting it, properly, so to speak, and use the fleece bags to cover the plant over when there was some severe cold. And what I found is the whole plant froze back down to the ground anyway. So essentially half-hearted protection for me really wasn't worth the effort. But again, I am in quite a rural part of the country and it was quite a prolonged freeze, so maybe that was a factor. So nowadays, I really have two directions to go for Musa basjoo. Number one, if you live somewhere that's relatively sheltered, if it's close to your house, if you don't live up north, then you just leave the plant to it. Most winters it should be perfectly fine. Just leave it, let the leaves brown, hang down, and they'll help provide a little bit of protection to the shooter stems. Yes, you might lose a little bit of height, but just chop it back in spring, somewhere around there. You tend to find the top foot or so can go a little bit mushy, or that plant will just start pushing out new growlers, no problem at all. If you live somewhere colder, you've got a younger plant, or you really do value the height, protect it properly. That's where I've changed. I honestly don't think it's worth cutting corners. So either use the traditional method of protecting it, which is basically put canes around the plant, use some chicken wire or fleece, wrap it around it, pack the whole thing with straw, and protect the top from water with either a big pot or some plastic. You can cover it over any time now. You might have to chop the leaves off to do so, but cover it over and then leave it until, we'll say, the middle of spring, by which point you can maybe take the top off and let it start to hopefully grow. That's one way of doing it. Or if you watch my video at Shane Bilson's, he had a method of using land drain, which is perforated pipe, putting that over the shooter stems once you chop the leaves off, covering the top with a pot, and then really protecting the base of the plant with some straw, really packing it in, which helps create a nice bit of root protection. And also those bits of land drain, the perforated pipe, are all you need to actually protect the stems themselves. So I would say that really is an efficient method if there isn't a brutally cold winter forecast. And let's face it, Shane sees temperatures -10 for days on end, so if it works for him, it's well worth a shot for you. So yes, when it comes to Musa basjoo, there isn't a right answer. Don't just do what someone on Facebook says they're doing. Really think about your area, what your garden's like, and if you're rural like here, it can often be the case that temperatures are maybe a degree or two lower than the forecast. The temperatures can stay colder for longer. So if you really want that height, if your banana plant is precious to you, I would absolutely protect it over the next couple of weeks. But other than that, as you can see, what I've done so far is absolutely minimal. To summarise then, in terms of what you do and when, now we're in the middle of November, there isn't a frost forecast necessarily, but the temperatures are going to get colder and it's likely that the next cold spell might be a properly cold one. It's time to actually get things ready, even if you're last minute like me. All my tender plants are in pots have been brought closer to the house. Some of them, the drier, arid type plants, can be brought inside. They will appreciate a bit of shelter from all this rain we have in. Others are ready to come inside or be moved into polytunnel or greenhouse. Now is a good time to do that. When it comes to planted out plants, such as these tender begonias here, it's not a bad time now to start digging these up. And again, you can leave them just outside your house until the minute that we get a real hard cold threatened, and then you can bring them inside and keep them as a house plant. My Ensete, although I always give you advice, leave them as late as you possibly can, it's not a bad time to start bringing them in now. Ultimately, we're in mid-November, so you've already got a month on those people that brought those back in October. It's not a bad innings, is it? So it's not a bad time to be thinking about those. So once all your tender plants are inside, including, not forgetting, ones like this Spanish moss, which can take a bit of cold, but let's face it, I want to bring it in. It's then time to turn your attention to the plants which stay in the ground. You can mulch some, like these gingers, which just need a bit of protection from the cold. Hopefully that's a long way off now, but it's well worth getting a bit of a mulch down and getting the job done while you can. When it comes to others which need a bit of protection, like the Gunnera or the tree fern crowns, again, it's not a bad time to be doing it now. You can't leave everything to last minute, otherwise you're definitely going to end up forgetting something. So I'd certainly recommend that. And then for the plants which need full-on wrapping, like potentially Musa basjoo bananas, there's no immediate rush to do it now, but it does generally need to be done, or at least you might as well get it done before we have any real cold. So I would recommend now, as we're heading into late November or early December, if you get the opportunity, if it's a dry weekend day, just get it done, make it happen. And that way, that pretty much means most of your garden is winter ready. And from that point, it's a case of sitting back and just monitoring the temperatures over winter. If there is real severe frosts and freezes forecast, then you can actually step up, protect feather palms in your garden, apply the extra protection to your tree ferns and ramp things up that level. But at least you've done everything you possibly can, and you can sit back and dream about all the sun and warm days we're hopefully getting next year. You'd assume that autumn's very busy, but let's face it, my garden time's been very, very limited this autumn. I spent one day so far tidying up, cutting back, that kind of thing, and I'll spend another day building the polytunnel, moving the plants into that I need. So really, a couple of days work to bring everything in for winter, and then just being on top of the forecast, it's not a big price to pay for having such a lush green garden for hopefully the rest of the year. I guess in conclusion then to today's rambling video, there isn't a right or wrong way to look after your garden in winter. It really is a case of preparing for the worst, knowing what you have to do, but also learning from your own experiences, taking into account where you are, where your garden is, and also what your soil's like as well. It really is a big factor. For me, I've gone from growing lots of tender plants which needed a polytunnel greenhouse kept frost free, to actually slowly phasing them out and moving over to a garden which needs a lot less care in winter. That means relying on a lot of the hardy exotics, the palms, the bamboos, which don't need lots of care. I don't grow that many tender plants anymore, only having a scattering of a few chosen ones, supported by castor plants which come back from the ground regardless. And now, the other benefit of being here, coming up, well, 4.5 years now nearly, is that plants like these Schefflera have now sized up where they should be absolutely fine outside in winter. So really, I guess the crucial thing is, look at your garden. Have a look outside. This is something that I mentioned before. Make sure you're not missing anything. Make sure you haven't assumed that anything's hardy. And if there's anything like a Coleus, definitely now is the time to get it in. And really, as we're heading to late November, if there's anything that you want to dig up, bring inside, wrap up, cut back, any of that, it's not a bad time to do it. Don't leave everything to last minute, otherwise you might just have a nasty surprise. But on that note, I've got stuff to be doing. So really, I hope this video has been helpful. And if there's any plants I haven't focused on in my garden that you'd like more information on what I do to look after them in winter, if you've got any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. But it's quite miserable now. The rain is picking up. It's time for me to get on. So thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you all very soon. See you later.